Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer, and on the eve of a presidential election that's just days away, we are going to be exploring 2 centuries of First Ladies, with part 1 taking us from Martha Washington to Ida McKinley, wife of the 25th president. And a little bit of history with me and First Ladies. One of the books that I bought, one volume at a time when I was 12 years old, is this wonderful American Heritage Book of the Presidents. And with these, it has all sorts of wonderful statistical information. I just loved these books. And having purchased the set up through Richard Nixon, I was riding the bus home in 6th grade, and one of my friends said to me, "I'll bet you $1 that you can't recite all the presidents in order in their years of office." And I said, "You're going to lose your $1, and I'll add to that. I can also name all of the First Ladies." And speaking of the First Ladies, back in the days when banks would give you prizes for opening a deposit account, when my mother opened a bank account, she got this really wonderful book called The First Ladies Cookbook. And this is a wonderful exploration of presidents' families, their homes, their recipes, and some of them in their original version. For example, Abigail Adams liked a wine jelly, but in the original cookbook from 1800, you had to take 2 calf legs, hang them up, and let the jelly drip out, and that was the basis of it. And the other one that was just uninspiring is James Buchanan's favorite recipe was mashed potatoes, like you need a recipe to make mashed potatoes. Another important step in my love of First Ladies is my 8th grade class trip to Washington, D.C. I loved the Smithsonian Institution and was fascinated by all of the mannequins and gowns that they had of the First Ladies. And with my allowance money, I bought a book that had 8.5 by 11 pictures of all the First Ladies. So when I started teaching at MSJ, I very carefully took apart the book, and I used those images for a bulletin board. And you can see in this snapshot from 1985, here I am in my classroom at MSJ with the First Ladies behind me, and that's Chrissy Nadler, who was my student, asking a question about her Latin homework. Let's start now with Martha Washington. Martha Dandridge Custis Washington was one of the, if not the wealthiest woman in Virginia when George Washington married her in 1759. This image of Martha Washington was painted in 1776 by Charles Willson Peale, and it is a companion piece to a similar miniature that he did of her husband, George Washington. And what I think is especially poignant about this is that George kept this image of Martha with him throughout the American Revolution. In this portrait, early in the Washington administration, a group portrait by Edward Savage, it tells us a lot about America's first family. We have George and Martha. They would have no children of their own, and her children by her first marriage died, and Martha and George raised the 2 grandchildren whom you see here. George Washington Parke Custis, who was on his grandfather's right, and Nellie Parke Custis. Standing behind Martha Washington is George's manservant, who was named York. One of the things that I was oblivious to in my early appreciation of First Ladies was the extent to which enslaved people were part of presidential households. And George Washington Parke Custis here, Martha's grandson, would become the father-in-law of Robert E. Lee, and his home was the Custis Lee Mansion just over the bridge from Washington, D.C., in Arlington, Virginia. And because of the split with the Confederacy at the start of the Civil War, the Union Army opened the Custis Lee Mansion as a hospital and started burying bodies in the backyard, so the family could not return there. And that is the basis today of Arlington National Cemetery. With Abigail Adams, a minister's daughter, we have someone who comes from a completely different walk of life than Martha Washington. She and her husband enjoyed an exceptionally close marriage, and probably one of the most memorable things that Abigail said was to John Adams when he was representing us at the Continental Congress, "Remember the ladies." And we have two other portraits here of Abigail Adams, one painted in London when John Adams was the minister to England, and then a later portrait by Gilbert Stuart. And like Barbara Bush, Abigail Adams has the distinction of being the wife of one president and the mother of another. Thomas Jefferson married a slave-owning widow named Martha Skelton. Their marriage only endured for 10 years before Martha's death. They had 6 children, 4 of whom died in childhood. We have no reliable image of Jefferson's wife, so during his presidential years, his daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, functioned as his hostess. And part of the cousinocracy that you would see among Virginia's wealthy families, Jefferson's mother was a Randolph, and daughter Martha married into the Randolph family. And a lot of these very close consanguineous marriages were to keep slaves in the family. Here we have one of the most famous first ladies who is the subject of legend, and it is Dolly Payne Todd Madison. She was a young widow when she married the much older James Madison in 1794, and of course she is well known in the burning of Washington for bravely saving the full-length portrait of Gilbert Stuart. And James Madison had a long decline in his health, and for years Dolly stayed with him at their plantation in Virginia, which was called Montpelier. And after his death in 1836, Dolly, who was low on funds, returned to Washington, where she became a hostess to many of the presidents in the 1840s. So here we have an image of an older Dolly Madison, and the interesting thing about Dolly Madison, I think, is that she lived into the age of photography. So here we have Dolly Madison, wife of our 4th president, photographed in a daguerreotype in the 1840s, in which she is holding on to the vestiges of her youth with the dark wig, with a high collar, and the turban on her head. Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe came from a wealthy New York family. She married the Revolutionary War hero soldier James Monroe in 1786. And this portrait of her was painted in the early days of her marriage when Monroe was the minister to France. And one of the most notable acts that she did at that time is that she saved Madame de Lafayette from the guillotine. Years later, this formal portrait of Elizabeth Monroe was painted. And even though she looks very, very elegant in this picture, she was a very sickly first lady and did not do very much entertaining. And she died just a year before her husband. Louisa Johnson Adams, wife of John Quincy Adams, was our first First Lady born outside the United States. She was born in London, married John Quincy Adams in London in 1797. They had a very, very distinguished family. And in this later portrait by Samuel Morse, we can see Louisa Adams as a woman of accomplishment in this, because women, wealthy women, would play the harp. So we have all the accoutrements here that we can see of privilege and wealth in this image. Rachel Donaldson Robards Jackson never lived to see her husband enter the White House, but it was a particularly contentious story because Andrew Jackson married her in 1791, thinking that her divorce was completed from the husband who abandoned her. But 2 years later, the husband turned up and said, "I never divorced you." So Andrew Jackson became the unwitting victim of bigamy and much political smearing. And yes, back in those days, presidential campaigns were fought viciously. And there were several duels in which Andrew Jackson mortally wounded his opponents, and they were all fought over slurs that were made against Rachel. So with Rachel's death on the eve of Jackson becoming president, his niece served as his hostess. Andrew Jackson's successor was Martin Van Buren, whose wife died early in their marriage. They had 4 sons, and this beautiful lady, Hannah Angelica Singleton Van Buren, served as her father-in-law's hostess during Van Buren's pregnancy, during his presidency. And here we can see that we have a bust looking on of Martin Van Buren with his beautiful and glamorous daughter-in-law. William Henry Harrison was the first president to die in office. He gave a lengthy inaugural address, contracted pneumonia, and his wife never even made it to Washington, but we want to honor her as a first lady. She lived many years after her husband's death, and in the 19th century, she held the record of presidential wives' longevity, living to the age of 88, and she would be the grandmother of another president, Benjamin Harrison. When John Tyler became the 10th president as the vice president who succeeded William Henry Harrison, this was a contentious passage of the torch because he was nicknamed his accidency. John Tyler married Young, his first wife, Letitia Christian, by whom he had 9 children. She died in his second year in office. And then 2 years later, John Tyler married Julia Gardner, who was 30 years younger than he. And you can see in this vivacious portrait of her, she was a very, very elegant lady. They would have 7 children together, which makes John Tyler, with a total of 17 children, our most prolific president. And their last child, so of the second marriage of Julia Gardner Tyler and John Tyler, their last daughter, Pearl, was born in 1860. And she died in 1947. So you can imagine a woman who died during the presidency of Harry S. Truman. Her father was born during the presidency of George Washington. The first presidential couple to be photographed together in a daguerreotype was James Knox Polk and his wife Sarah. They had been married in 1824, had no children. Polk was someone who ran his campaign on the annexation of Texas, the beginning of the war with Mexico. He died shortly after his term of office. His widow, Sarah, had a long widowhood, which was largely devoted to the perpetuation of her husband's memory. Here we have a group daguerreotype from the early days of Polk's presidency. So we can see right here in the middle, here is Sarah Polk, James Polk next to her, and the person who obviously moved during the long exposure time of the photograph is Dolly Madison. On the left, we have Margaret Smith Taylor, the wife of war hero, old rough and ready, Zachary Taylor. This is an enhanced image of her made long after the fact. She was not well, did very little entertaining during her husband's short term as president. And we have the second president to die in office when Zachary Taylor died in 1850. His successor was Millard Fillmore. His wife Abigail is in the daguerreotype on our left. And Abigail had tuberculosis and was too ill to do much entertaining during his presidency, but she is responsible for the establishment of the first White House library. Here is another image of Abigail Powers Fillmore. Jane Appleton Pierce, wife of Franklin Pierce, was too ill and too grief-stricken. They had lost both of their children before his presidency, and it was a time that the United States teetered towards dissolution. The 1850s were a very contentious era. Pierce is not recognized as one of our notable presidents, and he would be followed in 1857 by Pennsylvania's James Buchanan, who was our only unmarried president. And his hostess during the years in the White House was his niece, Harriet Lane, whom you can see in the lovely photograph at the right. Mary Todd Lincoln. Mary Todd Lincoln, many books written about her. Of course, we know that she spent time in Vermont at the Equinox House. Her eldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln, built his home, Hildene, in Manchester. He and Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd were very opposite in personality. She came from a well-to-do Kentucky family. This image of Mary Todd Lincoln was a pair of complementary daguerreotypes that were made in 1846. Mary's years in the White House as a Southerner with her 4 sisters married to officers in the Confederate Army was very bitter and contentious. She often had battles with Congress about her expense account. Here she is shown in one of her inaugural gowns, and then the image at right contrasts with her years of widowhood, where she descended into mental illness and had to be committed to an asylum by her son, Robert. Eliza McCardle Johnson, seen here above in an early photograph and then later in the marriage. Another very sickly first lady who left most of the entertaining to her daughter. When she married illiterate tailor Andrew Johnson, she gets the credit for teaching her husband to read and write. Julia Dent Grant. We sometimes forget that when Grant became the President of the United States after his years of service in the Civil War, he was the father of young children. And most of the images that we have of Julia Dent Grant, she is not looking at the camera directly. She had a cast in her eye, which even back then could have been fixed surgically, but Grant always said that he liked the cast in her eye, so she never had the eye surgery. And probably one of U.S. Grant's most heroic battles is after some disastrous financial decisions and knowing that he was dying of throat cancer, he sat at his Adirondack porch and penned his memoirs, which provided a basis of income to support his children and his widow up until Julia's death in 1902. And the trivia question, who is buried in Grant's tomb in New York City? And the answer, of course, is U.S. Grant and his wife, Julia. Lucy Webb Hayes, here in a daguerreotype shortly after their marriage in 1852 to Rutherford B. Hayes. Lucy Webb has the distinction of being our first lady who was a college graduate. And in a wonderful White House portrait of her, we have this full-length portrait of Lucy Hayes. And because she was an advocate of the temperance movement and banned alcoholic beverages from White House receptions, she has the sobriquet of being called Lemonade Lucy. Lucretia Rudolph Garfield was the wife of James Garfield, who arguably was one of our most intelligent presidents. He was a Civil War veteran, taught school, knew 5 languages, and sadly, he was shot just 3 months into his first term and died an agonizing death that took months. Wife Lucretia was at his side throughout, and she had a long widowhood, but was consoled by her family. And here we have an image of Lucretia Garfield taken in Pasadena, California, surrounded by her numerous progeny. Chester Allen Arthur, Vermont's first president, was married to Nellie Herndon, who died young. So she did not live to see her husband become the President of the United States. And during Chester Arthur's time in office, his sister, Mary Arthur McElroy, served as his hostess. One of the most popular first ladies, equal in popularity to Dolly Madison, was Frances Folsom Cleveland, who was just 21 when she married her protector, her guardian, in a White House ceremony. And because of her youth, the press was fascinated with her. And she was a beautiful woman, as we can see here from the photograph and the picture of her in her wedding gown. And she is the only First Lady to enjoy 2 non-consecutive terms as the wife of the 22nd president and as the wife of the 24th president. She had a child in the White House whose name was Ruth. Ruth sadly died of diphtheria when she was 10 years old, but baby Ruth is the person for whom the candy bar was named. This has nothing to do with the baseball player. Some years after the death of Grover Cleveland, Frances married as a second husband Thomas Preston, a professor at Princeton University, and you can see the image of her in the lower right-hand corner. And as we get into our 20th century First Ladies, there was much more of a gathering and recognition of surviving presidential wives. And Frances Folsom Cleveland has the record of having the longest period of time after the presidency. Rosalind Carter came very, very close to being, let's see, Rosalind died last year, so she would have had something like 43 years after the presidency. Frances Cleveland had 50 years after the presidency. Caroline Scott Harrison, seen here in her inaugural gown, was another ill presidential wife. She was not able to do much entertaining in the White House, and a couple of years after her death, her husband, Benjamin Harrison, grandson of the 9th president, married a second time. And that brings us to our last First Lady of the 19th century, Ida Saxton McKinley, who was married to the last of the Civil War veteran presidents, William McKinley, who was inaugurated in 1897. They had just 2 children, both of whom died in childhood. And entertaining was very, very difficult for Ida McKinley because she had epilepsy and was prone to seizures. And one of the most magnanimous and chivalrous things that her husband would do is, if there were a state dinner, he would look at Ida and she would start to have this noise of sucking in air, which means that she was about to have a seizure. And what her husband would do was stand up and take his copious dinner napkin and hold it over Ida's face so she would not have the shame of having people stare at her when she had a seizure. She was in the adjoining room when her husband was assassinated in Buffalo in 1901, and she would be the 3rd of the First Ladies to be present when their husbands were assassinated. That takes us to 1901, and in our next episode, we will begin with the first of the 2 Roosevelt First Ladies. We will begin with a nod to Theodore Roosevelt's first wife, Alice Hathaway Lee, who would be the daughter of his indomitable daughter, Alice Roosevelt Longworth. His second wife, Edith Kermit Carow, again would bring a young presidential family to the White House. And obviously there's much more that we will have to say about First Ladies in the 20th century and the role that they played in shaping the way that America viewed their first families. Stay tuned for part 2 next month. Thank you.